Hi, everyone, and a very warm welcome back. Thank you all for joining us for the second session of the Whole of Society Talks. My name is Sagar. I'm the chair of the technical subcommittee of the GEF CSO Network and Chief Technology Officer at Plan for the Planet. I'll be your host again today, and it's really wonderful to see many of you returning after our first conversation, and also to welcome new participants who are joining here for the first time. In the first session, we explored how communities can access GEF funding, looking at both opportunities and challenges under the Small Grants Program and the ICI. And today we're going to take the next step. Our theme is From Voices to Impact, Shaping an Inclusive and Accountable GEF-9. Today we'll focus on how inclusion can move from commitment to practice, how youth, women, Indigenous people, and civil society can play real role in shaping projects, influencing decisions, and ensuring accountability. Earlier this year, during the technical advisory group meetings and the CSO consultation we asked civil society what needs to change in GEF-9, and four things came out really clearly. First was inclusion. If we are serious about protecting the global environment, then we need a true whole of society approach. Second was scaling. The Small Grants Program and Inclusive Conservation Initiative have shown real success, and we're going to hear about them today as well. And now it's time to take that impact wider. And third, we found out barriers. Too many groups still face challenges with access, with capacity and engagement, and these obstacles need to be removed. And fourth is decline. We've seen a drop in CSO-led GEF projects, and that trend has to be reversed if civil society is to stay at the center of action. And that brings us to today. This session is about moving from voices to impact. We know the issues, right? So now we need to ask, how do we make inclusion real in GEF-9? How do we build accountability and transparency into the system from the very start? And how do we make sure that youth, women, Indigenous people, and civil societies are not just consulted, but have real influence over project and decisions? To explore this, we've brought together a diverse panel with voices from the agencies, from Indigenous leaders and youth, and from civil society itself. And before we begin, just a quick note on how the session will run. Each of our panelists will have a few minutes to share their reflections, both from their own perspective and from institutions or communities that they represent. And after that, we'll open it up for discussion and questions from all of you. And as always, please feel free to share your questions in the chat. If you can, please include your name and organization, so we'll get to know who is in the room, and we'll try to bring as much voices as possible after the panel is over. The session is meant to be interactive. This is not just a webinar, it's a space for exchange, for pushing ideas and shaping what we want GEF-9 to look like. So first, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Anita Tzec. Anita is Maya Yucate's leader from Belize, and today she serves as a senior program manager for Indigenous people and conservation at IUCN. She carries forward the teachings of her ancestors in her work, ensuring that Indigenous voices, priorities, and rights are not only recognized, but truly honored. Her focus is on opening pathways so Indigenous leaders can be at the decision-making table, bringing traditional knowledge into global conservation. Welcome, Anita. We're so glad to have you with us. Yeah, second, I'm happy to introduce Arturo. Arturo is the GEF CSO Network focal point for Mesoamerica, and he brings a wealth of experience from more than 35 years of work with Indigenous people and rural communities. He's a geographer from National Autonomous University of Mexico with a master's in rural development and PhD in ecology and sustainable development. Arturo co-founded and now serves as general coordinator of Institute for Sustainable Development in Mesoamerica. He also contributes as a member of the Advisory Council on Climate Change in Chiapas, the Political and Social Economic Commissions of IUCN, and as the editor of Diversity magazine. Arturo, we're very glad to have you here with us today. The next person on our panel, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Tauli-Corpuz. Jennifer comes from Kanaka, sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, Igorot Indigenous people of the Philippines. She's a lawyer by profession and currently serves as executive director of Gawis Indigenous Rights, as well as a fellow and a strategic advisor at Nia Tero. Jennifer has long been a respected leader in the international space. from biodiversity negotiations to intellectual property rights, always championing Indigenous peoples at the highest level. It's an honor to have you have your experience and perspective here with us today, Jennifer. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Shannon Lisa. Shannon is the interim global focal point for the UN Major Group for Children and Youth Chemical and Waste Platform, where she advocates for toxic-free future, ensures youth voices are present in global policy. She's also program director at Edison Wetlands Association and became widely known for her environmental detective work uncovering toxic contamination in Franklin, Indiana, work that led to a federal investigation and earned her the Brower Youth Award. Shannon, thank you for bringing the youth perspective into today's discussion. Now, to begin the panel, I'd like to turn to our speakers. Each of you will have about 5 minutes to share your reflections, both from your own role and from perspectives of the institution or communities you represent. We'd love to hear how you see GEF-9 moving from commitments to practice, what it would take to make inclusion real, to build transparency into funding flows, and to strengthen accountability across agencies. What's worked in your experience and what has not, and what needs to change as we move to GEF-9. After we hear from all of you, we'll open the floor and take questions. So to our first speaker, Anita, before we hear from you, we'll first play a short video you shared with us. It's called "The Path is Made by Walking." It's a powerful reflection on Indigenous leadership in conservation and what truly inclusive practice looks like. Let's watch it together.
Around the world, the Inclusive Conservation Initiative is catalyzing the transformational changes needed to secure and enhance support for the contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities to biodiversity and other global environmental benefits. In Kenya, Impact is working iteratively with Indigenous women and men across generations to co-create biocultural maps that reflect their realities.
First, we did the community meeting. This is about the FPIC. So prepare an informed consent. This is where we inform the community about the project, and so that the community would get to understand about the project, and then they give us their consent. We then ask them to give us some representative from elders, from the youth, from women, and across all the Paro community land.
Women would map resources based on where the water points are, where they go for prayers during drought season. And men will tend to map resources and their boundaries based on the grazing land, also the boundaries with other communities, and also where they used to have meetings, the important sites where Council of Elders will have meeting. And it was a complementing activity because the elderly men and women could not draw, but the youth mappers do the sketches. So the bicultural maps that were generated is inclusive of the knowledge of both older men and women and youth also who went to school and who did not go to school.
We were sketching the maps together in the communities, and they were able to make sketches of the things that are of biocultural importance to them, how they relate with their landscape, the resources. Second step was digitization of the maps. We sat together with them, and we were able to digitize the maps and be able to feed every information into the computer, printing them, so that we can now take them back to the communities for validation.
These maps will strengthen the recognition and support of governments and other stakeholders to better understand and uphold the rights of Indigenous Maasai peoples who are nomadic and have experienced challenges in bridging this knowledge and resulting policy gaps.
Pastoralists are mobile people. They don't stay in one place for long, and they really have an understanding of their areas where they used to go. And the project will open eyes of our authorities, other stakeholders in many good ways. This involves forums like this where we bring the communities and other stakeholders together to come and share ideas. And because the project is not targeting to distort systems, but just to have the rights of the indigenous people, recognize their knowledge, recognize, preserved, and have a good understanding with the authorities, with other stakeholders, and find a way to collaborate, to partner, and to contribute better.
In fact, with just 1 year into field implementation, ICI has completed 38 biocultural maps around the globe. In Tanzania, these have paved the way for 12 certificates of village land covering over 200,000 hectares, which have been secured. In Chile, a historic co-governance agreement was signed for Villarrica National Park, covering 17,000 hectares in co-management.
They feel like inclusive conservation is the way to go in terms of recognizing communities as the key stakeholders or the right holders of their land, in their territories, their culture, traditions, and the role they play in conservation of biodiversity.
And by the end of the project, I am hopeful that the communities will be in a better position, will be better strengthened, also to understand their rights, their roles, and have their ways, like dealing with their land in their own terms.
Thank you for sharing such inspiring video with us, Anita. Back to you. The Inclusive Conservation Initiative recently shared a report titled Walking the Talk, How Inclusive Conservation is Delivering Results. Your report shows that simplified finance plus capacity support really works, right? So if you had to pick just 2 lessons that GEF-9 should institutionalize so that this becomes a standard practice, what would they be? And beyond consultation, how can agencies create a real decision-making space for stakeholders? From your experience, what has worked and what has not?
Okay. Thank you very much, Sagar. To begin with, I want to say that thank you for the invitation. I think these conversations are very important, but most importantly, I am hopeful that the GEF will actually take into consideration some of the recommendations that come out from these conversations to really make adjustments to the GEF system, beginning from the financial system, if we're talking real inclusion and if we're talking moving towards a more transformative conservation with indigenous peoples. In the Maya calendar today is the day of what we call Eh. Eh means the path. So for us, being here today is not a coincidence. I am hoping that the light and the lessons we will be able to share with the GEF today will actually be used to craft that new path, that different path that leads us towards a more inclusive and impactful conservation on the ground with our indigenous peoples. Yes, our report, and as you can see, the video summed up some of the lessons from this report, that simplified finance works and capacity building in a day-to-day approach of learning by doing and hand-in-hand walking the talk with indigenous peoples works. Now, simplified finance. Our systems that we operate through are not simple. So that's one first thing. I think we all know that the financial architectural system that currently exists has failed Indigenous peoples. And that these systems need a lot of work opening their bottlenecks to ensure that it actually works for Indigenous peoples. Through ICI, both IUCN and CI, Conservation International, we are co-implementers of this initiative, have had to do major changes in our institutions, especially our financial systems, in concrete, our granting systems, to be able to work in a flexible way and a way that responds and takes into consideration the context of Indigenous organizations that we are working with and who are the executors of ICI in their territories and communities. So to begin with, the first lesson is, if we are to have financial systems that are more not only responsive, but are actually taking into account the context of Indigenous organizations and communities, we have to ensure that our systems are changing to be able to respond to that and to take that context and capacity into account. Otherwise, we will forever be trying to force a new way of work in a system that doesn't operate and is not beneficial for Indigenous peoples. So that's the first thing. The second thing is capacity support. And capacity support through ICI is dual. If you look at the conservation and climate change world, the brunt of learning and improving their capacity and scaling up their capacity is always put on Indigenous peoples. This has to change. The capacity building, the learning by doing, the growing together has to be dual. Dual means, yes, Indigenous peoples, we need to increase our learning and capacity in terms of what these systems are, how to report to these systems, but these systems also need to learn from us. Yeah, so this is a dual process if we are to do things differently and things that will work on the ground. In ICI, IUCN and CI have both had that approach. To begin with, we have a one project approach for ICI, and that capacity building and that learning by doing has been dual. We have streamlined, we have simplified templates, we have provided guidance on these financial systems, but we have also learned from our Indigenous organizations on the ground what works for them. So that has to be something that escalates into the GEF. Otherwise, we will continue to try to have an inclusive approach, but without the architecture of a system that wasn't built for Indigenous peoples. No? So those are the two main things that I can say, and I'm really hoping that for the GEF-9, these are taken into consideration. So institutions like the GEF, IUCN, CI, the WWFs, we need to be open to understanding the capacity of communities, but also we need to be open to learn from them and be able to respond to the realities on the ground. This will lead to a win-win situation. Yeah, a situation where it is not expected that only these institutions will win by investing in inclusive conservation, but also that it is going to be a win situation for communities, and also to show the general successful performance as we're having in ICI. In a nutshell, those are the two things I would say, and I'm really hoping that GEF-9 can be inclusive of these.
Thank you so much, Anita, for those reflections. Now, let's turn to Jennifer. The ICI report shows Indigenous organizations successfully managing funds and governance. From your perspective, what is still missing in GEF projects to make Indigenous leadership and knowledge central rather than peripheral?
Thank you so much, Saga, for this opportunity. And thank you to Anita for presenting the report, the latest report of ICI, because it's really truly amazing what has been accomplished under ICI. And I'm part of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which is also part of the implementation of ICI. But I'm also engaged somewhat in the GEF-8, what we call a dedicated mechanism, which is called the Heart of Conservation Initiative. It was initially called ICI-2. And it's good to see the progression in how the GEF has been transforming its systems, and how the GEF and the GEF agencies are beginning to be open to Indigenous leadership. For example, ICI has opened up the possibility of having a steering committee for the project that is Indigenous-led. And I think that's very important. And then also making a point in having Indigenous staff within the project management units, and as much as possible engaging Indigenous consultants. So what this has proven is that, well, the advance here is that now we have proof of what Indigenous peoples have known, that we are capable of managing funds, we are capable of governing, and we do have contributions that we can make to achieving global environmental benefits, implementing the CBD and the Global Biodiversity Framework. So I think it's important, this dedicated mechanism, ICI, Heart of Conservation. It started in GEF-7, continued in GEF-8. And in GEF-8, I think the very important innovation is looking at Indigenous-led funds, which is the attempt of Indigenous peoples to actually put in place systems that will solve the issue of Indigenous peoples still being peripheral and not central in these kinds of initiatives. So it's important that GEF-9 continues this establishment of what we would call a dedicated mechanism for Indigenous peoples. One other important development, I think, from other spaces is the acceptance or designation of an agency of the GEF that would be Indigenous-led. And I would point to the Green Climate Fund, which recently accredited an entity called the 10-Year Facility that was specifically established, exclusively to work with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants. So I think it's also time to start thinking about within the GEF an entity that is specifically, a GEF agency that's specifically working on Indigenous peoples' issues. And then I think I really like what Anita presented around the need to update the indicators and the systems. So beyond the financial systems, actually what we're struggling with now is the indicators, because most of the indicators are really conservation related and not very it doesn't reflect the cultural aspect and the spiritual aspect that has enabled Indigenous peoples to be very effective stewards of nature. And so there's a real need to update these indicators so that it's something that Indigenous peoples can connect better with, and that can capture better the contributions that Indigenous peoples make. And finally, I completely agree with what Anita said around the culturally sensitive approaches. So there need to be differentiated approaches in how the safeguards are implemented in the context of Indigenous peoples, as well as this transformation in thinking that templates can solve the problem. Because for many of the questions that we had around cultural sensitivity, the answer that we usually got is, there's a template for that. And when you look at the template, it does not reflect at all the situation of Indigenous peoples. And then, it's one thing to have a dedicated mechanism, but the other aspect is also how to mainstream Indigenous peoples in the work of the GEF. And I think there's an important innovation from GEF-8, which is some national projects actually have a specific component that looks at Indigenous peoples. And maybe that can be looked into and further strengthened under GEF-9. I'll end it there so that we have more time for the others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for those insights. Really, really insightful. Now, from one youth to another, Shannon, what would it take for young people to have real influence in GEF-9? not just being invited to events, but actually shaping projects, resources, and accountability?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question and for the invitation from the GEF CSO Network to be here to offer some of the youth perspective. As Sagar mentioned, I'm Shannon. I'm focused on the chemicals and waste focal area, and I serve as the global focal point to the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform, which is a universal youth constituency, meaning any young person under age 35 can join, and decisions are taken by the whole of the constituency. We have over 2,500 grassroots individual youth members and 400 youth-led organizational members, and we facilitate meaningful youth engagement in the work of the BRS conventions, the Global Framework on Chemicals, and the Minamata Convention, which has a COP coming up, so preparations are in full swing. These are our core engagement areas, but there are at least 7 other environment cluster youth constituencies that are mapped across the multilateral system. These are, for example, YOUNGO for UNFCCC, Global Youth Biodiversity Network for CBD, and UNCCD Youth Caucus, of course, for UNCCD, to name a few. And the 7th GEF Assembly, so this was back in 2023, was the first time that youth and youth constituencies were formally engaged and invited to a GEF assembly. And we, alongside our sister constituencies, welcomed at that time the launch of the Fonseca Conservation Leadership Program for Youth as a first step and an important signal of the interest and priority GEF was placing on youth. But you're exactly right, Sagar, what youth constituencies who have been working across the MEAs and their implementation are asking for goes beyond merely just being invited to events, after decisions have been made already, or being, as we often are, just symbolic or abstract representations sitting in the room, getting people to think about, quote, the future. We want a role in setting the agenda and delivering the work within GEF. And I think the first structural change that would go a long way for meaningful youth engagement in this upcoming GEF cycle and in future GEF cycles would be for the GEF to co-design in partnership with the existing youth constituencies formal youth engagement guidelines and making meaningful youth engagement a requirement in all GEF decision-making processes. And another practical step is to make sure youth have a standing place in GEF's own country and regional consultation processes. So every country develops a country engagement strategy, and the GEF holds expanded constituency workshops to bring governments and stakeholders together. And youth need to be systematically included in those spaces. And we see value in creating a standing youth track or a youth-focused agenda item in every ECW and CES cycle. We also encourage increased integration and participation of young people in active GEF programs and panels, such as the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. And finally, we really want to see more participatory monitoring by involving youth in tracking whether GEF projects are delivering results and making youth contributions more visible and auditable across the portfolio. So in short, youth engagement, as this word has been mentioned by previous panel speakers, should be mainstreamed into GEF and also learn from what is already being done to enhance the focus and investment in gender and in Indigenous peoples. And it was really amazing to see what Anita has shared on the ICI of what working with or walking the talk with Indigenous peoples can and should actually look like in practice. And we on the youth side are certainly taking away a lot of inspiration and ideas even from that work and all the insights being shared on this meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for bringing in that perspective. Now let's turn to Arturo. Arturo, as the GEF CSO Network focal point for Mesoamerica, you've seen how civil society engages with these processes, right? How can operational focal points and agencies like IUCN and others proactively open space for CSO engagement early in the project cycle?
Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you to everyone, especially of those who are organizing this event and allow me to share some ideas. Saludos, Anita. Tiene tiempo que no te veía. The first step is to agree on the main priorities, especially the strategic agenda of CSOs in global environmental issues. We can learn from the feminist and indigenous movements, which have defined their agendas clearly around equality, rights, and inclusion. At key moments in the past, CEOs at the global level have also pointed out topics and regions that organizations like the GEF should focus on. Recent examples include food security and sustainable communities and cities. CSOs now need to come together, set their agenda, and present into the operational focus points and agencies. This will help align efforts and create space for new ideas and perspectives. At the same time, it's important to identify priority places for strategic actions. For many years, GEF investment have focuses on the same areas and issues in a repetitive way. Only recent has there been a shift recognizing not only conservation, but also socio-environmental approaches, including cultural and local perspectives. For example, 25 years ago, civil society and coffee organization promoted organic certification as an environmental innovation. At that time, GEF did not fund many projects because conservation dominated its agenda. Today, organic coffee is so common that it will no longer be seen an innovation for GEF. About 10 years ago, innovation meant bringing gender perspective into international coffee production and trade. Interest in this project is now growing, and GEF will likely join in with funding. This means civil society should propose new paradigms that are more strong social inclusion in the coffee value chain. This is especially relevant for the emerging trend of gentrification, where new consumer demands affect producers. In coffee growing regions, this could undo progress in conservation and inclusion if quality and flavor in the cup become the only priority.
Now I'd like to go back to Anita. You shared how CI and IUCN had to put new systems in place as you learned working with Indigenous people. My question, perhaps you could expand upon how GEF agencies GEF agencies like IUCN and CI, there are more of them, and how they can create real decision-making space for stakeholders, right? I think what can they learn from you guys? Could you expand on that? And to support that, what could be the policy changes for GEF-9 based on these findings?
Okay, thank you. Yes, there are three main things that I want to put on the table. One, the decision-making space has to be Indigenous-led. Yeah, we have passed the time for mere consultation. This is over. I still see in the global space, we're talking about consultations with Indigenous peoples. We need to go beyond that. We are now at a time where the conservation community needs to be fully aware that we need to be working more on the full and effective respect and upholding of the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. What does this translate into? One, that we can no longer be talking of Indigenous peoples as just mere stakeholders, or even worse, beneficiaries. That is still in the GEF language. That needs to evolve. we need to recognize Indigenous peoples as the rights holders. They are the rights holders of the lands, territories, and resources where they are. So the basis for functioning, the basis for developing any initiative has to be that framework. In ICI, that is the core, at the core and center of how we operate. We have an Indigenous governance body. That Indigenous governance body is made up from Indigenous leaders on the ground, from the communities, from the organizations that are executing ICI on the ground. And they are the decision makers. They drive the high level decisions and the path of where ICI is going. So that's one. I think more agencies need to use that approach. My dream and the dream of many Indigenous leaders is that one day, hopefully not too far away, Indigenous organizations can also become GEF implementing agencies. Yes, it is a big target. It is a big dream, but we also need to be working towards that. Otherwise, we will forever have intermediaries in a system that already doesn't really operate for us. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that through ICI, we had what is called the development of the impact strategies. In project language, it is the full project proposal of each of the organizations, the Indigenous organizations who are on the ground executing ICI. IUCN and CI did not craft those project proposals. Yeah, this took like a whole year of process where the Indigenous organizations who were selected to execute ICI on the ground designed that. Yeah, this was based directly on what their communities identified as their own needs, their own priorities, and why reinvent the wheel? Also by scaling up what they were already doing and what they know works in their communities. So that full impact strategy was developed by them. Of course, IUCN and CI provided the technical support because, as Jing had mentioned, many templates come with this. However, in ICI, the project management unit, we did months of work to simplify these GEF templates and ensure that what we are doing is streamlining what the GEF is requiring, etc. So it was a hand-in-hand work that was done with the Indigenous organizations. So I think that more GEF implementing agencies need to learn from that process and need to do this in a really meaningful, inclusive way with Indigenous peoples on the ground. That would be my recommendation for other GEF agencies operating and working on Indigenous peoples and conservation. So I will leave it there, conscious of the time for my other colleagues here.
Thank you very much, Anita. Now I will transition to Jennifer. Building on what has been discussed here and what you shared earlier, how can traditional knowledge and Indigenous governance systems be integrated from outset of project design? And could you share what safeguards are needed to prevent tokenism or exclusion?
Yes, I am. Well, having been involved with a GEF project and now the process of crafting concept notes under an Indigenous specific executing agency under the GCF, I can see some difference, no? Because I was brought on board for like I said earlier, the Heart of Conservation initiative, but it's a little bit like being dropped in the middle of the process, no? So they wanted an Indigenous expert because the concept note had already been approved. So the PIF had already been approved, but in order to really embed Indigenous peoples and make traditional knowledge central to the project itself. What I'm seeing now with the process in the other side of the pond under the Green Climate Fund is that the concept note crafting itself is being led by Indigenous peoples and consulting with traditional authorities of Indigenous peoples on the ground. And that's just So that they're being engaged in a very, very, very early stage of the process. And I think this is something that the GEF can learn from, that we bring in Indigenous leadership and Indigenous traditional authorities as early as possible in the process, not just the project implementation stage or the project preparation phase, but in the crafting of the concept notes. And in that way, the engagement, the involvement is not tokenistic. It is central. So that's one. And of course, the concept that Anita mentioned, free, prior, and informed consent, is quite important there. The second point I'd like to make is that when the standard way that you craft GEF projects is that you have to express the global environmental benefits that you can deliver. And these global environmental benefits are standard, no? They're standardized across GEF projects. And it's really hard for Indigenous peoples to connect to these global environmental benefits in a very cultural way. And so there needs to be changes, especially now that the GBF, which the GEF is also bound to implement, has a lot of new language on Indigenous peoples, including in Target 3, Indigenous and Traditional Territories. So there should be an adjustment of these global environmental benefits to reflect those accepted new language that talks about what is important for Indigenous peoples. And then lastly, I talked about it earlier, indicators, is how do we incorporate some of the Indigenous specific indicators that have been accepted under the GBF so that it reflects better, what Indigenous peoples regard as important. For example, land use and land use change and land tenure in Indigenous and traditional territories is already accepted as a headline indicator under Target 22. Why can we not have this instead of just, increase of the number of hectares of protected areas, or increase or improvement of the management of protected areas and OECMs? Now that we have language that talks about Indigenous and traditional territories, can we not change the indicators being used, the standard set of indicators being used by the GEF, so that Indigenous peoples are better reflected and can better engage with these global environmental benefits and the indicators? So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now back to Shannon. Earlier, you spoke about the importance of real influence for youth. What mechanisms do you think should GEF-9 adopt to actually fund and support youth-led initiatives? And if you had one message for the council members hearing us, either here or in our recordings, what would you ask them to change in GEF-9?
Thank you very much, Sagar. I'll offer a few priorities from my constituency's perspective, again, working on the chemicals and waste cluster. But I think one first step that I think would be important for the GEF Secretariat would be to work with all of the environment constituencies that exist to co-host youth consultations leading up to the next GEF-9 meetings, and for a more complete report to be prepared that captures youth recommendations across all the focal areas. But from my side, and I'm going to be bold here because there really is no institutionalized youth engagement in GEF yet, so I think anything I say will be bold. But in the case of youth constituencies now, really the only thing currently making youth engagement possible in the MEAs and global environment project implementation is youth's own willingness to do this work on a voluntary basis alongside our day jobs, and in many cases to fund our own participation. So a lot of this right now is really only being held up because youth have been willing to make the sacrifices to ensure that our voices are heard in these processes. But of course, that in and of itself is not sustainable. I mean, what could we do if we were actually institutionally and financially supported in a permanent and not a transient way? And so the most clear need from my perspective is dedicated, flexible funding windows for youth-led implementation initiatives, which can include blended approaches. Applying for GEF funding right now, I think many local communities can also speak to this. it comes with institutional requirements that most youth networks, especially those working at the grassroots level, cannot meet. And wouldn't it be an amazing precedent to establish a dedicated, youth fund, and for youth constituencies to be able to co-design the fund and participate in its oversight versus only being beneficiaries? And Jennifer mentioned, related to the Heart of Conservation initiative, with moves being made to have steering committee for projects that are Indigenous led. And what a great initiative. And we need the same for youth focused projects to also be youth led and youth driven. And we're already seeing, at all levels, greater support by donor countries for youth empowerment. Momentum has even been built more following the adoption that some of you might have heard about of the Pact for the Future last year, which included an entire chapter 4 dedicated to youth and future generations. And this was adopted, at UNHQ in New York. And it focused largely on strengthening youth engagement in multilateral systems and decision-making. And that's where those formal youth engagement guidelines, co-designed with youth within the GEF, I think are also needed. And as for, kind of boiling this down to a single message for council members here in the room, in terms of asking what we would change for GEF-9, I would say recognizing youth as co-implementers and not just beneficiaries is critical. And I think council members should request the Secretariat to create clear guidance on youth engagement in projects, and for this to be also backed by dedicated financial support. Without this, youth contributions continue to largely remain invisible in these projects, even though we're critical to project sustainability and accountability. So thank you, Sagar.
Thank you, Shannon. It is a request, and I hope GEF-9 will be able to accept and transition us to become more inclusive. Before I wrap up our rounds, I would like to hear from Anita and also Jennifer. If you could implement one bold reform in GEF-9 to make it more inclusive and accountable, what would it be?
Okay, thank you, Sagar. That's a tricky question because I don't have one recommendation. I have several, but I will go with the 3 main things as lessons we have learned in ICI. The first thing is, I think the GEF really needs to take a moment to do some reflection and self-critique. Why? Because we're at a stage where there is an opportunity to do things differently, but it's also a responsibility. Yeah. First thing first. There are many GEF requirements that become or have become key bottlenecks for inclusion. Yeah. So if we are talking about inclusion, if we're talking about supporting walking the talk, if we're talking about ensuring that we effectively support Indigenous peoples to scale up conservation actions and deliver global environmental benefits, this is a must. This reflection is a must. I will give you one very basic example, which is not very basic, that we faced from the beginning through ICI. The GEF requires, as a system, that we receive a no objection letter from the countries where investments will be going to if we are to invest on the ICI. That requirement is a key bottleneck when it comes to Indigenous peoples. Why? Because in many countries, as some of you will know, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and governments is not the best. Okay? I think that's common knowledge. So if you're asking the very same government that is suppressing, marginalizing Indigenous peoples for a no objection letter for investments to come, what do you think is going to happen? Some cases is you will not get it. This happened to us in ICI. It is essential that the GEF really looks at this. And if we're talking about real inclusion and transforming these systems so that they are more inclusive, I understand that the GEF-9 is looking for that, then these considerations need to be taken into account. So that's one. Secondly, if you look at the monitoring system that the GEF has in place, specifically on reporting on the core indicators, Jennifer has made a notion of this. Many of these indicators, while they are reporting on global environmental benefits, they're not applicable to the context of Indigenous peoples and what Indigenous people see as necessary and identify as necessary to be reporting against in their communities and what keeps their territories healthy. Through ICI, we have been doing work on developing Indigenous cultural indicators. And this is now part of the reporting system. And hopefully this will influence the way the GEF reports on Indigenous indicators and targets and benefits. Yeah, this is necessary. Right now, we already have the new CBD GBF. In ICI, we are making the effort to ensure that we take these into account because many of these or most of these that apply to Indigenous communities were developed with Indigenous peoples. One simple example. Okay, we have a core indicator that speaks of terrestrial protected areas created or under improvement for the conservation and sustainable use in number of hectares. In Indigenous communities, we are not creating new protected areas. Yeah, we are looking at our territories as the repositories of life, of biodiversity. And we have our own ways, biocultural protocols, biocultural mapping that is used to report to this kind of indicator. So those adjustments need to be made to the system. Thirdly, the rigid reporting system that the GEF has. If we're saying I remember when ICI was created, it was said it's a different kind of initiative. It's Indigenous owned, Indigenous led, Indigenous content. Well, guess what? Your rigid reporting system should also be Indigenous. It should, we cannot be creating an initiative that is different, that comes to work on conservation with people in a different way, but try to force it and fit it into the rigid systems that we have. So that needs to change. I will leave it there because I could go on, but I think from the experience in ICI, these are the challenges we have seen. These are the policy changes that I see are necessary in the GEF. And I really hope that we're speaking today and some of these recommendations actually make it into conversations for transformation in the GEF-9. Yeah, I will leave it there. And I could actually be closing with a question to the GEF. And I don't know who in high-level decision-making in the GEF is here in this webinar today. How much of this that we're talking today will actually be taken up? Because we can debate about this and discuss about this, but I think we have an opportunity, a real opportunity. We are showing what works and what doesn't, and the GEF has the responsibility. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Anita. If somebody from GEF Secretariat would like to speak, we will offer them the floor later. There is going to be GEF replenishment meeting in Botswana in October. Faisal, this chair of GEF CSO Network, will also add a little bit of details on how that works and how CSO Network and IPAG can influence this. But this is a very, very important conversation we're having. With that, Jennifer, the same question to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'll build on what Anita said because I agree with everything that she has said. And it's difficult to choose only one. Yeah. But I think I'll try to confine myself to two. One is that it's important to maintain a space where GEF is able to innovate and to learn lessons from Indigenous people. So inclusive conservation, heart of conservation, whatever we want to call it for GEF-9, needs to continue because it's a space for learning, mutual learning exchanges, and not just a one-way street of learning. But also recognizing that this ICI, HCI, and whatever the new iteration is going to be under GEF-9, it's a very small amount of money compared to the overall budget of the GEF. And so it's important also for Indigenous peoples to be mainstreamed in the main instruments, the grant instruments that the GEF has. And in order to make sure that Indigenous peoples, are again, as we said, central and not peripheral, not their engagement is not tokenistic. It's important to look at the lessons coming from GEF-7 ICI, GEF-8 Heart of Conservation Initiative, and embed them in all the other work and in all the other grants that the GEF has. So these ideas around reflecting the culture and governance, the knowledge of Indigenous peoples needs to be reflected also in the other instruments and the other grants that the GEF makes, particularly the country grants. So yeah, those two, maintain the learning space, but also make a very, very conscious decision to mainstream. And I think, if you look at the GEF projects, there are components that are included across the board, like monitoring and evaluation, knowledge management. Why not also have something that's included across the board, at least in places where there are either Indigenous peoples or local communities, a specific component on Indigenous peoples and or local communities, so that in that way, we're also able to tap into the other resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Shannon, if you'd like to add something, the floor is yours.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I'll just wrap up. I know there's some that have had their hands up for quite a while, so I'll be very quick. But just to reiterate, priority from that I'll offer is we want to see formal and resourced youth engagement policy or guidelines within the GEF that are co-developed with youth and that have dedicated funding and mechanisms for monitoring how youth are involved across the GEF portfolio. And for us to focus on future-proofing the GEF by ensuring that kind of intergenerational collaboration. And just wanted to say, to Anita and Jennifer, would really be keen to connect with you after this and learn more about the work you have done, to push for reforms of the GEF funding system to be responsive to Indigenous peoples. And we certainly stand in solidarity with you and your recommendations as youth and fellow rights holders as well.
Thank you very much, Shannon. I see that our former speaker, Kristen from session 1, has her hand up. She's from Conservation International. I'd like to give her a few minutes, maybe 2 to 5 minutes. Please try to be brief. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I won't repeat any of the great comments that our speakers have made, Anita, Jennifer, and others. But I do want to highlight that if we're talking about a new and more inclusive GEF-9, that this meeting itself should be more inclusive. While I appreciate Arturo speaking in English to us, the meeting should be more accessible. Y quiero agradecer a Arturo por su presentación en inglés, aunque yo sé que no es tu idioma. I think it's more important if you're trying to get input from civil society that these meetings should represent civil society. The GEF is a multilingual and a diverse entity and should reflect that in these types of consultations and engagements. And I think people should be able, I understand it's very challenging to represent all the languages, but at least a minimum, there should be a fair set of good languages to be able to do that. And I think in the experience of ICI, whether it's GEF-8 or GEF-7 or GEF-8, we are all operating in multiple languages to the extent that it's exhausting. But we are trying to make sure that people can effectively engage and provide their inputs in that process. And I just want to leave that maybe as an underpinning. Again, if we're talking about transformation, then these engagements need to represent the diversity of those actors, be it Indigenous peoples, local communities, youth, women, to be able to give them that access to engage in a meeting like this. So maybe that's just my statement for the day. Y gracias de nuevo, Arturo, por tu presentación en inglés.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kristen. I would like to highlight that this meeting is hosted by GEF CSO Network on a voluntary basis. I would very much like to have translations of these meetings, and I would really appreciate if we could raise that capacity within the CSO networks, within IPAG and other communities through agencies. The support would be very, very much appreciated. And I think we are together in this. I understand that this is the first step to go into that conversation, to collect the voices and to reach the audience we want. And I really appreciate your feedback. I would now like to open the floor for questions. If you would like to raise your hands, and if you've shared the questions, please raise your hands and we will go in the order that you raise your hands. All right, we're gonna go to Anita. Please, I've requested to unmute your microphone if you'd like to add.
Thank you so much. My name is Anita from Nigeria. Hello.
Please continue, Anita.
Okay. I quite appreciate the webinar and all the speakers. It's so beautiful, and I'm happy that I'm able to make it to join the webinar. But what is bothering me is the way the indigenous people and the vulnerable community. I am from the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, where extractivism, all extractive mining and everything is going on. And the people are not actually taken care of, and including the environment. And I was particularly happy when I came in contact with GEF during COP29. And I had hoped for a channel where we'll be able to work to be able to uplift the living standard of the community, especially my community, Ibno, Nsibom, and the local government area. I conducted a research and sponsored by Gaga, and I discovered the menace, the health situation of the people around there because of the effects of this mining, and even the fishing area, how it is so affected. I want to ask, how can GEF CSO Network come to the aid of this, our indigenous community, since we don't even have the project we are trying to do at the community levels with the schools, with the women and the rest? We don't have funding. And we've been attending programs, but we don't know how to get to be funded. Is there any way that you can let us know how we, the vulnerable communities, can get direct access to GEF funding and its programs?
Thank you, Anita. Maybe Anita, this is something you can briefly add on. How can civil society organizations, indigenous people get access to funding?
I think this is a question more for the GEF itself, not for me. This is a question where the GEF needs to look at the channels that it is currently using to channel resources to the ground more directly to indigenous peoples and local communities. I think the experience that we have through ICI and through channeling resources to indigenous organizations directly. Currently, we are working in 12 different countries with 10 different organizations around the world. It's one thing. It's an attempt to make it more direct and more inclusive. But I think this is a wider conversation that needs to happen with the GEF. The GEF is also currently the host of, and Jen, you will know better than me, of the GBFF, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. If I look at it the way it's operated right now, I don't know that it's the best and most appropriate or most inclusive way it's operating. It's going to countries. I think some look There needs to be a good look at that and be more inclusive of how these funds can go more directly to Indigenous peoples. I also know or understand we have the Small Grants Program that also has GEF funding. But to me, this is a wider conversation with the GEF. How the GEF system operates, what are those channels through which the GEF provides resources for the ground. And I think a look needs a wider look needs to go beyond us here at the CSO. I think it's a necessary conversation if we are to scale up the work we have been doing, for example, through ICI.
Thank you.
I'll
Thank you
leave
very
it
much.
at that.
Thank you, Anita. If any other panelists would like to add something, please. Otherwise, I will go with Lynette. I've requested to unmute your microphone.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you so much for the presentations. They were power-packed presentations. Okay, so I will start by giving an example of where I come from also. Where I come from is Beitbridge. The place is called Beitbridge in the southern part of Zimbabwe between along the Limpopo River. Okay, so you realize that as indigenous people, there are many environmental challenges being faced. For example, where I come from, it's a semi-arid region, and we are trying to work with the communities and stuff. But in the channel of reaching out to organizations like GEF, there is a bit difficult for us. Just like the last the last speaker said. Okay, so last year I was fortunate enough because I was part of the Youth Negotiators Academy, and then we're trained to go to COP29, and we were also part of, and then GEF managed to fund for our flights. Then we met the CEO there at COP29 and other people, and they were discussing with us. They were saying they would like to work with us as the youth organizations, because we work with those indigenous people. We are part of those indigenous people, I can say. Okay, so when you get back, you realize that how can I be part of these programs? Yes, GEF is open for us, is open to help us, but how can I be part of this program so that I can implement, I can work with these indigenous people at the same time partnering with the GEF? So that's the question, because at the end of the day, you realize that when you go back to your country, you continue with as indigenous people, but you don't have maybe there are no channels, that you can reach GEF.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynette. I believe this question is also addressed directly to GEF Secretariat. Gabriela, I believe you are on this call and you are available to speak. If you'd like to, please.
Thank you so much for this really fabulous, I have to say, really, really interesting conversation. And maybe I should introduce myself first. I'm Gabriela Richardson-Tem. I lead the GEF Small Grants Program and support a lot of work in the GEF on civil society engagement. So I think we've heard in this meeting, and I'm not going to answer all of the questions. There's been a lot of questions, but as Sagar has mentioned, we will look at the recording and try to answer a lot of the questions separately later. But I just wanted to say first that we've heard a lot about how the ICI initiative has really been, innovative in many ways. But we also heard, Anita, you said many times, we also have to take a step back and reflect on what is working, what is not working. We have also heard on the Fonseca leadership program that was introduced in GEF-8. We've heard a little bit less in this meeting about the Small Grants Program. And the Small Grants Program, in fact, has a very strong support for Indigenous peoples and youth engagement. And just to tell you that for those that don't know, and I can provide more background later, is that the Small Grants Program has operated since 1992. And I think we have distributed about $1.5 billion to civil society, Indigenous peoples, youth, and women groups through this program over more than now 30 years. And one thing that we have done and that really focused on in GEF-8 was to increase the financing scale and scope of the program. We have introduced new implementing agencies. We have expanded the country coverage. We have now 134 countries that are covered by the program. And a lot of the things that you've been talking about here, for example, I was listening to, I think it was also Anita, about the indicators. There are things that's going to happen in GEF-9 that to update our core indicators to better incorporate ability for us to capture socioeconomic co-benefits and ensuring that we can track financing to Indigenous peoples, youth and women groups, etc., so that we have a better ability to do that. What else could I think of? Yes, I also wanted to just take this opportunity to really thank the CSO Network for doing these consultations. And as Sagar has mentioned, these are really organized. These consultations have been organized by the network itself, independently from us. And I very much appreciated it. And I'm sure that the chair of the network will come in later. But these are really important, not only for the GEF Secretariat to listen to what you have to say, but it's really important for the network who sits and is represented at the replenishment meeting, and one of the upcoming one that Sagar was mentioning in Botswana soon. We have also, just for your information, made some changes to the governance of these replenishment meetings, and there will also be representation of Indigenous peoples in the replenishment meeting. So those are just a couple of things to reflect a little bit on what you're saying. And thank you. And thank you, Sagar and the CSO Network, for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. So before we close this session, I'd like to invite Faisal Paris. Faisal is chair of the GEF CSO Network to share his reflections on today's session and also say a few words about the upcoming GEF ECWs and the next meeting of the GEF-9 replenishment. Faisal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'd just like to say a few words about the way forward, how the GEF CSO Network. Thank you, everyone, and for a very useful meeting and good interaction. And please do keep the comments coming. As mentioned by Sagar, this is the second in a series of meetings that we're organizing over the next 6 to 8 months to get really input from the grassroots, from civil society, into the replenishment process and into other GEF reform processes. So I just say a few words about the GEF replenishment process. This is the key mechanism for both the finance pledging by the donor countries, but also the policy setting for GEF-9. GEF-9 is basically for the next 4 years, starting next year, for 4 years up to 2030, what will be the key policies. And the next meeting for the replenishment process is going to be in Botswana in October. And that is going to look again at 2 critical documents. One is what GEF calls the programming directions. That is looking at each of the focal areas: biodiversity, climate change, land degradation, chemicals, etc., and then trying to decide or confirm what are the key directions, programming directions. So it's very critical that in all of these directions that we get civil society embedded, or key issues from civil society built into that framework. We understand that we will get a draft document sometime next month, and then we will have ability during the meeting in October and following that to give input. The second key document is called policy directions. Policy directions is going to more look at the institutional mechanisms of GEF, the organization, the implementing agency, and the engagement with the whole of society would be looked in those policy directions. So similarly, we need to really get a key element of Indigenous people, local community, civil society, fully engaged and mainstreamed into those
key mechanism and policy papers. We have already given quite a lot of input to the process from February. There have been one meeting in February and one in May. We've already given good input, and the indications are that this whole of society approach has been recognized as a key element of GEF-9. But it's very easy to say whole of society. It's much more difficult to embed that fully into the mechanisms. So I'll just highlight a few of the key directions the GEF CSO network has highlighted so far. One, we have proposed that for GEF-9, 10% of GEF resources go direct to civil society, including CSOs, Indigenous people, local community. And that can be particularly through the small grants program. The small grants are a program which we propose to at least double, and the scaling up of the ICI that has to much more than double from, I think, 20 odd million to much larger. So there is a larger amount can support that very key mechanism. The second area is that we feel Indigenous people, local communities, civil society really need to be mainstreamed into the so-called full-size projects. That's the 90% of the GEF portfolio that is generally channeled through governments, organizations. And we feel that all of those projects should, I think was mentioned by Jennifer earlier, to have a component that deals with Indigenous people, local community, youth, and other key stakeholders that can be built into the project. So overall, we want this whole of civil society approach fully integrated into those key documents and the policies. We also need, there's no point in having good policy and there's no money. We are also calling for a doubling of the overall GEF resources, 5 billion in the current GEF-8, and we feel there should be a doubling. That is going to be a major challenge with a lot of distractions and political issues in the world, but we really need to push for, at minimum, maintaining the current funding, but we really need to increase. So there is more of the cake to go around. So I think those are just some of the critical things that are coming. And I think all of the views shared today, previous meeting, and whatever you can input to us. And for those who are members of GEF CSO Network, we'll be mailing out or sharing with you information and seeking your input. Those who are not members of the CSO Network, please do join, link up, share your views, give your input, and we will try to bring these views into the replenishment process, which is quite critical. We have this meeting in October. There's another meeting in December, but by December, everything on the policy direction and so on is going to be more or less set. And then there's a final meeting early next year, which is the pledging how much money or resources. But we need to get the policy frame right, and we need to get the broad support. So we also, very important for civil society organization to lobby and inform your governments, your contacts, particularly if they're from the participating in the replenishment process. And replenishment process is not only the donors, there are also some recipient governments, and we can certainly make available the list of those countries and those representatives participating in the process. So I think we will try to enable opportunities to give input, and we really hope that this will lead to a positive way forward. Finally, I'd just like to mention there is a mechanism, I think mentioned by some others, ECW, expanded constituency workshops. These are being held on a regional level. Next month, there will be one in Gambia for West Africa. Then there will be in October one in Latin America. And in these meetings, GEF Secretariat, GEF agencies, GEF country focal points, convention focal points, civil society organizations, broad range of stakeholders will attend. This is also a very good opportunity in this period to influence and input to the council members, to the key country representatives, to get this pressure to fully endorse and integrate whole of society approach and build that into GEF-9. That's very important. Your voices are made very loudly heard, but we also have to be practical and link into the process and documents. So please do keep in touch with us after this meeting. Share your views. We'll document here. We will share back a short report on this. Sagar will give some more update on that. But really do remain in contact with us, and we will see how we come together, push for necessary reforms and enhancements so that there is real resources available. There's improved and simplified access, and that the access and engagement possibilities are culturally appropriate to Indigenous people, local community, and others. So thank you again very much for coming today, and let's have this journey together of transforming GEF, making GEF a greater and stronger entity to help civil society, Indigenous people, local community, and transform the global environment as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal. A big thank to our panelists as well, Anita, Jennifer, Shannon, Arturo, who was not able to be here due to some electrical issues, for sharing your insights with us today. Special thanks to my colleague Prem for coordinating all of this. This brings our session to a close. Our third session will be in about 3 to 4 weeks, and we'll share the invitation with you all very soon. And please leave us feedback on Luma. You will get an email in about 30 minutes. We'd really value your thoughts on how you found the session and what we could improve and what the themes for the next sessions could be. So that's the end of the session. I will be here together with my colleague from CSO Network for the next few minutes if anyone would like to ask questions or connect on how to engage with GEF CSO Network, etc. Thank you all, and see you in the next session.